8 years ago, my parents cut me off and said I'd never make it without them. Today, at my brother's wedding, my dad raised his glass and sneered. Still renting, huh? I just smiled, slid the keys across the table, and said, actually, this venue belongs to me. I, 32M, just revealed the truth about my success to my family after 8 years of silence. The champagne flutes clinked around me, but I barely heard them. I was too focused on the look spreading across my father's face as he stared down at the keys I'd just placed in front of him. Heavy brass, attached to a leather fob stamped with the venue's logo. His mouth had gone slack, and for once in my life, he had absolutely nothing to say. Let me back up. 8 years ago, I walked out of my parents' house with nothing but a duffel bag and the clothes on my back. I was 24, freshly graduated with a degree in hospitality management that my father had called worthless more times than I could count. He wanted me to join his accounting firm, to follow in his footsteps like my older brother had done without question. When I refused, when I told him I wanted to build something of my own in the events industry, he lost it. The ultimatum came fast and brutal. Either I abandoned my foolish dreams and joined the family business, or I was out. No financial support, no safety net, no family backing. My mother stood behind him the entire time, silent but complicit, occasionally nodding along to his pronouncements about my immaturity and unrealistic expectations. My brother sat at the kitchen table, barely looking up from his phone, probably relieved the spotlight wasn't on him for once. I chose the door. My father's parting words still echo sometimes. He told me I'd be back within 6 months, broke and humiliated, begging for his help. He said I didn't understand how the real world worked, that my generation expected everything handed to them, that I'd never make it without the family name and connections. My mother added that I was breaking her heart, that I was selfish and ungrateful after everything they'd provided. I didn't come back in 6 months. I didn't come back at all. The first year was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I crashed on friends' couches, worked 3 jobs simultaneously, and ate ramen more nights than I care to remember. I was a server at a mid-range restaurant during dinner shifts, helped with events set up for a catering company on weekends, and did overnight inventory at a hotel. I barely slept. My body ached constantly, but I was free, and I was learning. More importantly, I was watching. I paid attention to everything. How venues operated, what made events successful, where the industry was inefficient, what clients actually wanted versus what they were being sold. I saved every penny I could, living so lean that my friends worried about me. But I had a plan forming, something I couldn't quite articulate yet, but could feel taking shape. After 18 months, I'd scraped together enough to rent a tiny office space with 2 partners I'd met in the industry. Both were as hungry and desperate as I was. We started an event planning company that focused on what larger companies ignored: small to medium-sized events with personalized service at accessible price points. Weddings for normal people, not just the wealthy. Corporate events for startups, not just established firms. We worked insane hours, took jobs others wouldn't touch, and built our reputation one event at a time. The company grew faster than we dared hope. Turns out there was a massive market for quality event planning that didn't require a trust fund. Within 3 years, we'd expanded from planning to also providing full-service coordination, vendor management, and even venue consulting. We were profitable, sustainable, and getting noticed. By year 5, we made our first major move. A historic building in the city had been sitting vacant for 2 years after a previous owner's bankruptcy. It was beautiful, but needed significant renovation. Most investors saw a money pit. I saw the venue I'd been dreaming about since my first event planning job. My partners and I leveraged everything we had, brought in some additional investors, and bought it. The renovation took 8 months and nearly broke us. We lived at the site, doing much of the work ourselves to save money, hiring specialists only when absolutely necessary. But when we opened, it was perfect. High ceilings, original architectural details, modern amenities, flexible spaces that could transform for any event type. We priced it competitively and focused on service quality. Within a year, we were booked solid 6 months in advance. During all of this, my family and I had virtually no contact. My brother reached out once, about 2 years in, with a brief text asking if I was still alive. I responded that I was fine. He never followed up. I heard things occasionally through mutual acquaintances. My parents told people I was struggling, working odd jobs, that they'd tried to help, but I was too stubborn. The narrative they constructed painted me as a cautionary tale about youthful arrogance. I didn't correct anyone. I had nothing to prove, and honestly, I was too busy building something real to worry about their version of events. Then, 3 months ago, my brother got engaged. His fiancée, from what I gathered, came from a wealthy family that moved in the same social circles as my parents. The wedding was going to be a major event, the kind my parents could show off at. I assumed I wouldn't be invited, and I was fine with that. The invitation arrived 6 weeks before the wedding. Just a formal card in the mail, my name printed in elegant script, no personal note. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decode the gesture. Was this an olive branch? A courtesy invitation they assumed I'd decline? A way for them to claim they tried? I almost didn't go. My partners urged me to ignore it, to keep the door closed that I'd walked through 8 years ago. But something shifted in me as the date approached. Not a desire for reconciliation, exactly. More like curiosity about who I'd be when I walked back into that room. The scared 24-year-old who left, or the person I'd become since. I RSVP'd yes for one. The wedding venue my brother chose was upscale, but ultimately generic. One of those hotel ballrooms that tries to manufacture elegance through sheer expense. I knew the place. We'd actually consulted for them 2 years back on improving their event flow. They'd ignored most of our suggestions. I arrived deliberately late to the reception, after the ceremony and cocktail hour, when people were settling into dinner. I debated what to wear and ultimately chose a well-tailored suit. Nothing flashy, but clearly quality. I wanted to look successful without appearing like I was trying too hard. The moment I walked in, I felt eyes tracking me. My parents were at the head table with my brother and his new wife. My mother saw me first, and I watched her lean over to whisper something to my father. His head snapped toward the entrance, and even from across the room, I could see his expression harden. I made my way to my assigned table, which was predictably at the back, filled with distant cousins I barely knew. They greeted me with the kind of superficial warmth that meant they'd heard the family story about my failures. I smiled, made small talk, and watched the room. My father was holding court at the head table, clearly in his element. He'd had a few drinks already based on his volume and the flush in his cheeks. My brother looked happy enough, though he had the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone overwhelmed by their own wedding. My mother was the perfect hostess, smiling and gracious, but I caught her glancing my way several times with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dinner progressed with the usual wedding reception rhythms. Toasts, laughter, clinking glasses. I stayed quiet, observing more than participating. A few relatives asked what I'd been up to, and I gave vague responses about working in event planning. Nothing specific, nothing that would generate follow-up questions. Then came the moment that changed everything. My father stood for what I assumed would be his father of the groom toast. He had that particular swagger of someone who loves being the center of attention, especially when he's had just enough alcohol to remove his filter, but not enough to slur his words. He started with the expected remarks about his younger son, about family, about the beautiful wedding. Then his gaze landed on me, and his smile took on an edge. He started talking about success, about the importance of making smart choices, about how he and my mother had tried to guide both their sons toward secure futures. My brother had listened, he said, and look at him now, successful in the family firm, married to a wonderful woman, stable and settled. He paused, and I knew what was coming. His eyes locked on mine across the room, and he raised his glass slightly in my direction. The question came out loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Still renting, huh? Didn't quite work out the way you planned? The surrounding tables went quiet. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My mother reached for my father's arm, but he was on a roll, enjoying himself. He continued about how pride comes before a fall, how some lessons have to be learned the hard way, how it's never too late to admit you were wrong. Everyone was looking at me now, waiting for me to shrink, to flush with embarrassment, to confirm his narrative that I'd failed and he'd been right all along. I could feel the weight of their expectations, the story they'd all been told for 8 years being reinforced in real time. I stood up slowly. The room got even quieter. Instead of responding to his question, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the keys. I walked through the tables toward the head table, my footsteps echoing slightly on the hardwood floor. People leaned back to let me pass, conversations dying as I moved. When I reached my father, I placed the keys on the table in front of him, right next to his champagne flute. The brass caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. I kept my voice level and clear, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, but not shouting. I told him that actually, I wasn't renting. I explained that the venue he'd chosen for my brother's wedding, this beautiful space he was currently celebrating in, belonged to me. Well, to my company, technically, but I was a founding partner and primary owner. The color drained from his face. I continued, keeping my tone professional, almost conversational. I mentioned that we'd been booked for this date for over a year, that his deposit was what had helped us purchase our second venue last fall, that the staff he'd been complimenting all night reported to managers who reported to me. My mother had her hand over her mouth. My brother was staring at me like I'd just appeared out of thin air. His wife looked confused, probably trying to reconcile whatever story she'd been told about the family outcast with what she was witnessing. I picked up the keys again and told my father he could keep them as a souvenir, but I had copies. Then I thanked him, genuinely, for cutting me off 8 years ago. I explained that his refusal to support me had been the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to build something real, something I actually cared about, something that was mine. I said I wouldn't have the life I have now if he'd gotten his way, and I was grateful for that. The room was completely silent. Somewhere in the back, someone's fork scraped against a plate, the sound impossibly loud. I turned to my brother and congratulated him on his marriage, told him the venue staff would take excellent care of him for the rest of the evening, and that the wedding had been beautiful so far. He managed to nod, still speechless. Then I looked back at my father one last time. I told him I'd never come back begging like he predicted, and I never would. I'd build a life I was proud of, surrounded by people who believed in me and what I was creating. I said I hoped someday he'd realize that success wasn't just about following his path, that maybe he'd even be proud of what I'd accomplished. But either way, I was done trying to prove anything to him. I walked back to my table, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the exit. Behind me, the murmur of conversation started up again, louder and more urgent than before. I didn't look back. I made it to my car before my hands started shaking, not from fear or anger, but from the sheer release of 8 years of carrying that weight. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, just breathing, feeling lighter than I had in years. Update 1. I didn't expect this to blow up the way it did, but I wanted to update you all because the aftermath has been intense. The morning after the wedding, my phone started ringing before I'd even had coffee. My brother called first, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. The conversation was awkward and stilted. He told me that after I left, the reception had essentially split into 2 camps. People who'd known my parents' version of events and were stunned, and people who hadn't known there was family drama at all and were just confused. Apparently, my father had tried to save face by claiming he'd known about my company all along, that he'd even helped fund it initially. Multiple guests who'd worked with my company directly shut that down immediately. One couple, whose daughter's wedding we'd done 2 years ago, apparently stood up and praised our work extensively, mentioning how professional and independent our operation was. My father left the reception early. My mother stayed but was, according to my brother, barely holding it together. My brother said he wanted to meet for coffee. He claimed he hadn't known the extent of how successful I'd become, that my parents had always implied I was scraping by and too proud to admit failure. He said he should have reached out more, should have checked on me himself rather than just accepting their narrative. I told him I'd think about it. Then my mother called. That conversation was harder. She cried, which I'd expected, but what surprised me was the anger underneath. She said I'd humiliated my father at his own son's wedding, that regardless of our history, what I'd done was cruel and vindictive. She asked how I could be so heartless, so determined to hurt them. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting. When she finally stopped, I asked her a simple question. Had she ever, in 8 years, tried to find out how I was actually doing? Had she driven by my office, looked up my company online, asked anyone who might know me what my life was really like? The silence on her end told me everything. I explained that I hadn't gone to the wedding to humiliate anyone. I'd gone because I was invited, and I'd stayed quiet until my father decided to publicly mock me. All I'd done was correct his assumptions with facts. If that was humiliating, maybe he should consider why the truth felt like an attack. She hung up on me. The most unexpected call came yesterday from my father. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Flat, tired, stripped of the certainty he usually carried. He didn't apologize, exactly, but he said he'd done some thinking. He admitted he'd been telling people I was struggling because that's what he'd convinced himself must be true. The alternative meant he'd been wrong about everything, and that was harder to accept. He asked about the company, about how I'd built it, about the actual details of my life over the past 8 years. I found myself telling him, not because I needed his approval anymore, but because it felt like maybe, finally, he was actually listening. The conversation ended without resolution. He didn't apologize for cutting me off, didn't take back the things he'd said. But he did say that what I'd built was impressive, and that he'd underestimated me. Coming from him, that was something. I don't know where things go from here with my family. My brother and I have coffee scheduled for next week. My mother hasn't called back. My father sent a brief text this morning asking for my company website, which I sent without comment. What I do know is that I'm okay with whatever happens next. I spent 8 years building a life that doesn't require their validation, and that hasn't changed. If they want to be part of it, they can try. But the power dynamic has shifted permanently, and we all know it. Someone asked in the comments whether I'd planned this reveal all along, whether I'd accepted the wedding invitation specifically to drop this bomb. Honestly, I don't think so. When I RSVP'd, I genuinely wasn't sure what I wanted from the evening. Maybe closure, maybe just to prove to myself that I could walk back into that room without falling apart. But when my father stood up with that smirk, when he tried to publicly diminish me in front of everyone, something crystallized. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. I realized I was done being the family story about failure and pride. If he was going to force the narrative into the open, then he was going to get the real version, not the one he'd constructed to make himself feel better about disowning his son. The keys were always in my pocket. I'd grabbed them that morning out of habit, the way I always carry them when visiting one of our properties. But sliding them across the table wasn't premeditated revenge. It was just the cleanest, clearest way to communicate a simple truth. You were wrong about me, and I don't need you to admit it anymore. Update 2. It's been 3 weeks since the wedding, and I figured I owed you all a final update since so many of you have been following this journey with me. The coffee with my brother actually happened, and it was better than I expected. He was more genuine than I'd given him credit for. He admitted that he'd always taken the easy path, following my father's plan because it was simpler than fighting. He said he'd envied my courage to walk away, but had been too comfortable to follow. He'd accepted my parents' version of events because it was easier than confronting them or seeking me out himself. We're not suddenly best friends, but we're talking. He wants to build something real between us, and I'm willing to try. His wife, apparently, thought what I did at the wedding was badass, which made me laugh. She's been pushing him to establish more independence from my father anyway. My mother and I had lunch last week. She actually apologized, for not reaching out over the years. She admitted she'd been scared of my father's reaction if she maintained contact with me, which was both sad and clarifying. She's still navigating that relationship, but at least she's being honest about it now. I don't know if we'll ever be close again, but we're not hostile anymore, and that's something. My father is the complicated one. We've had 2 more conversations, both initiated by him. He still hasn't fully apologized for cutting me off, but he's asked detailed questions about my business, about my life, about my plans. Last week, he mentioned that he was proud of what I'd built, that it took more courage and skill than he'd given me credit for. He said it differently than the path he'd have chosen, but that didn't make it wrong. It's not the sweeping apology some of you wanted from me, and honestly, I wanted it too. But I'm learning that my father may never be capable of that kind of vulnerability. What he's offering, acknowledgement, respect, genuine interest, might be the best version of reconciliation he can manage. I'm still deciding if that's enough for me. The business continues to thrive. We're opening our 3rd venue in 6 months, and we're in talks about a 4th. The publicity from the wedding drama, ironically, has been incredible for us. We've had a spike in bookings from people who heard the story and wanted to work with a company with that kind of origin story. Several people have asked if I regret how things went down at the wedding, if I'd do anything differently. The honest answer is no. For 8 years, I let my family believe whatever narrative they wanted about me because I was too focused on building my life to care. But when my father tried to publicly shame me, staying silent would have meant accepting his version of reality. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was just honest. If that made people uncomfortable, that says more about the lies they've been comfortable with than about my decision to tell the truth. Would I recommend this approach to others dealing with family estrangement? I don't know. Every situation is different. What I do know is that sometimes the only way to move forward is to stop letting other people write your story. I'm in a good place now. Better than good, actually. I have a business I'm proud of, partners who've become like family, and I'm starting to rebuild some bridges with my actual family on my own terms. The scared 24-year-old who walked out with a duffel bag 8 years ago wouldn't recognize the life I have now, and that feels like its own kind of success. Thank you all for the support, the advice, and even the criticism. This community helped me process everything, and I'm grateful for that.